morning, church. How's everybody doing? Good morning, everybody out in Zoom land. Today, I want to talk about fear, more specifically, overcoming fear. It came about as a kind of a funny way. Last Sunday, I was watching a football game, and they had my team in it, the Kansas City Chiefs. I don't know if anybody else is a Chiefs fan, but it wasn't so much the game that, and well, I did something to these glasses. I can't even see through them now. But I noticed I was getting into it. Probably more so my wife noticed I was getting into it. That, they were winning and then they kind of revert back to what they do to lose. And so I started yelling at the TV and I get real negative. I get real, here we go again, wah, like a big baby, And my wife, and it got so bad, she's like, I don't even like watching the game with you. And she screams at the TV too, but not like me. And it's probably more of a Debbie Downer, kind of way of things that I had of looking at it. But it really stuck with me. It bothered me. It troubled me all night. And the next morning I got up and had this quiet time and I was listening to this podcast that I usually listen to and from time to time. And that's exactly what the guy talked about fear. And I was like, God, is that it? Is that what's going on? Am I afraid to give myself to something for fear of, it not turning out well? And, it was it. And this is just a football game. It doesn't matter. We're not going to talk about that. But, it was such a powerful quiet time. I remember, I haven't seen Charles in quite a while. I haven't seen a lot of you in quite a while. But I like talking to Charles whenever I can. I just call him up, and if we can talk, we do, we don't. And I just shared this quiet time with him that I had. And he goes, well, that's exactly what the group needs to hear. And I said, well, okay, that's good. Because, and I shared with him, one of the things that I really learned about my fear is when I was younger, I had time. And I had all the energy in the world and the strength. I played hockey. I didn't care. I had no fears. But as I noticed as I get older, and if I make a bad decision or something goes wrong, I don't have the ability to recover. Business investments, things like that. And if you make a wrong turn at this point in my, if you're my age, it's very hard to recover from. Yeah. And it kind of sets your destiny out. So I worry about those things. And you could even say I have fears of it. Boy, this is really bad. And it really told me I've got some ungodly fears here, because I have to look at my life as a whole thing, and we'll get to that. But, and I'm not talking about phobias. Oh, thanks, hon. I tried my jacket, but I must have scratched these or something. But which are irrational fears. I mean, they're actually, diagnosed conditions. But, you can fly on an airplane 30,000 feet, but yet have a fear of elevators. Yeah. Those are kind of irrational fears, But what I want to talk today about is the spirit of fear. And fear is not bad. God gave us fear. That's right. In times of emergencies or fearful situations, it gives us strength, gives us extra speed, energy, whatever we need to overcome a fear or a dangerous situation. But, the spirit of fear, it can take hold of us. And, it can terrorize us. It can dominate your life. And you don't even know it a lot of times because you just have been in it. And, one of the things that somebody said one time is, fear can be a small trickle of doubt that runs through our minds and eventually wears a great channel that all of your thoughts drain into it. And I thought about that. I was like, boy, it's so subtle. But that's exactly what happens, and we all have fears. And, I've counseled people and being in the ministry. I'm sure Bob can attest to this when they were given bad news, or, cancer or something happened with their children, the children ran away, or things aren't going well. I've seen men leave their wives And the woman just so fearful of raising kids by herself. And I've had fears. I have fear of speaking. I honestly do. And especially when I first started, I had a period in my life when I had cancer too. And I was given 5 years to live. And thank God it has made it a lot longer than that. Having children. You cannot have children without having fear. I'm sorry. There's just, if you do, then check your pulse, And not only do you have fear for them, one of the things when I was thinking about this is I remember my kids going through things and I could feel their fear. That was even worse than my own fears because then it took a whole new level. Like I said, fear's not a stranger to us. It's kind of like that boy that had 2 lines in a play. And it was, it is I, do not be afraid. And he walked out on stage and said, I'm here and I'm scared. That's kind of how it is. We maybe have this persona, but the reality is, and I knew, that this was exactly what God wanted to, because Friday morning, when I started really organizing my thoughts about this, I stopped, took a little break, and I got this email. I started looking at some emails. And one of the emails was to our company, our e-commerce company. And it said, look, we've hacked your site. We're going to destroy you. We're going to take every customer you have. We're going to sell it to the highest bidder, to your competition. Then we're going to hit everybody's credit cards and they're going to blame it on you and make sure they get an email saying that unless you send us this amount of money in Bitcoin. And I was like, wow. And at first I was sitting in my car, but I was like, wow. And I kept reading and I was like, it gets worse and worse. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, look what I'm talking about. Look what I'm getting ready to talk about. And immediately the whole thing lifted off. It's like, go ahead, do it. I dare you. I didn't say that. They said they wouldn't read my email. So just send the money. But I just said, no, I serve a God that's bigger than this. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, that it shows, the Bible shows us that God's people have to deal with fear throughout the Bible. There's no such a thing as reality without fear. And so that was one of the things that, because you're going to have it, but you have to, you think about the Bible and all the stories. I think about the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and they were terrified. Everything around them, and they had God in their boat, but they were horrified, terrified. And then you think about in ancient history, David and Goliath. And what really sticks to me about that is not that one man had courage, but it's that a whole nation didn't. Right. There was not one person in all those people that would stand up to Goliath. I think the story that best illustrates what I want to talk about today is found in, it's actually found in a couple places. It's the story of the 12 spies. And I think it portrays the principles that I wanted to talk about today the best. And it's about a time where these 12 spies, they left Kadesh Barnea on their way to the land of Canaan, and they were going into the land that God had promised, the land of milk and honey. And it's found in Numbers 23 and 24, but there's a more condensed version that we're going to read from today in Deuteronomy chapter 1. And it records the event that in the story that I want to build on that really identifies these principles of fear that come right out of the text. So we know that for 400 years, the Israelites have been enslaved in Egypt. God brings out Moses, they get free, they go see all these miracles, go through all this stuff. They come across the desert, ready to enter the promised land, and the land given to them by, that was promised to Abraham, all the way back to Abraham, the land of milk and honey, the land they dreamed about all those years in slavery. And God even says, hey, yeah, grab some spies, go in, look at, check out the people, check out the cities, find out the best route to go in there. And as we read the text, we'll see that the principles of fear we deal with are not any different than the principles of fear that they dealt with. And that's important. But the first point I want to talk about is fear disregards God's plan. And we'll start in verse 19 of Deuteronomy chapter 1. It says, then as the Lord our God commanded us, we set out from Horeb and went toward the hill country of the Amorites through all that vast and dreadful desert that you have seen. And so we reached Kadesh Barnea. Then I said to you, you have reached the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord your God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up, take possession of it, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. And so here, God is telling them, and how many times in there that it says, the Lord your God has given you, the Lord your God has commanded, the Lord your God, the Lord your God. And yet, what did they do? They refused to go in. They were afraid. God gives them this invitation, but they didn't go in because of fear. They wouldn't take their inheritance. And, it's kind of like what Paul was saying to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:7. He says, we were not created as creatures dominated by fear, but by faith, strength, and self-discipline and love. He says in the book to Romans in 8:15, God did not give us a spirit of timidity or fear, but of power, love, and self-discipline. That's actually 2 Timothy. In Romans 8:15, he says that he did not give us a spirit of fear, which makes us slaves again, but gave us a spirit of sonship by which we cry out, Abba, Father. God's plan is that we live above fear. God's plan is that we walk in the power of his love. That's our inheritance as Christians. We are not to live in fear as the world does. If we allow fear to dominate, we lose out on God's plan for our lives. Our inheritance as God's plan for us is to live lives in a way without fear. Live a life of love, live a life of faith, not fear. Another thing that comes out of this is fear distorts God's purposes for our lives. In verses 27 and 28, it says, "The Lord, you grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord hates us. So he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers have made us lose heart. They say the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there." And the Anakites were these giants. They were big men. They believed that Goliath was probably an Anakite. But fear will take everything in our lives and distort it. It takes our perspective and distorts it, our perspective of God, and convolutes it. You become disillusioned by it. 10 men distorted a picture. Great land. But they said, we can't do it. They're too strong. Their cities are fortified. Anakins, the giants. It says they saw a giant. Didn't say everybody. There's no evidence in the passage that says everybody was a giant. But they took one giant and created an entire population of giants. It's kind of what happens with us, with our fear. We get one fear and one doubt or one distortion. And it's like that thing I said about, it's like this, trickle that turns into a channel that all our thoughts go down. They were so impressed by what they saw, they convinced themselves, and as irrational as this sounds, that after God had done all that he had done, that God had taken them there to make sure that they were destroyed, that they would. Now that's irrational. That's a distorted view of what is going on. And we say, well, yeah, that's really out there. But you know what? Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever felt that way? Man, I've gone through all this and, been through all these things. And now God just wants to, because I did this or this didn't go right, I'm going to get smited. Yeah. And that's what fear does. It distorts our reality. It distorts your life. It distorts your life, your perspective, and how you think about God. Another thing that we get out of this text, fear destroys everything in our lives and discourages God's people. Fear is a very contagious thing. As we found out here, these 10 men, only 2 men were faithful. 10 men came back and changed the course of an entire nation, an entire generation of people for 40 years because they wouldn't take their inheritance. They didn't believe God. After God had done all that for them, they said, no, we're not going to go do it. You know, they not only talked about giants, but they brought one of the giants back with them. They brought back the giant of fear. And that giant walked into their camp and destroyed the entire nation's faith. You know, I really thought about that, and I started thinking, you know, how much fear distorts God's purpose and discourages his people. And I look at my own life, and it really touched me because I'm like, even though it was a football game, you know, how many other areas of my life am I like that? And I'm sure Carmen could probably point out a few, you know, where I get a little negative, where I'm not trusting, you know. It's bad. You know, another thing we get out of here, fear disbelieves God's promises. And in verses 29 through 33, he says, then I said to you, do not be terrified, do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes and in the desert. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son all the way until you reach this place. In spite of this, you did not trust in the Lord your God, who went ahead of you on your journey in fire by night and in a cloud by day to search out places for you to camp and to show you the way to go. So here's this, and I can hear God's emotion in this, you know, like a father carries his son. I carried you. You know, it's emotional. God is feeling this. He's feeling them not, you know, believing in his promises all this time, and he gets angry about it, and he gets hurt. It's as though everything he had done up until this point in their lives never happened. It's like he didn't matter anymore. He didn't care. They didn't care. You know, that's one of the things as I realize as I get older, when I have these kind of challenges to face fears and different things, you have to do it each and every time. You know, even though I've seen so much and God's done so much, each time it seems like Satan knows to take it up a notch. You know, he's the master of this fear. And it's just like that email, you know. I would have probably gone on 3 or 4 days, probably wouldn't have come up here this weekend because I would have been in contact with every IT guy I know, every, you know, internet security person. I would have made sure that nobody, you know, and spent who knows how much money doing it. But, you know, it gets to a point where you're just like, you have to trust God. Right. He's brought you through all this. You know, another thing we get out of here, fear disobeys God's principles. You know, in verse 26, he says, but you were unwilling to go. You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You know, simply put, it's sin. You're rebelling against God. You know, it comes down to obedience. You know, in the Bible, I didn't count it myself, but somebody said like 365 times it says, fear not. It's over 300, I know. But the Bible, I mean, just look how many times he says it in this passage. I'm leading you, the Lord your God. But they didn't believe it. And the thing that, you know, really caught my attention was probably the biggest fear. Well, what was going to happen to their kids? You know, I think if I was them and I started worrying, I was like, well, these people are going to kill all my kids. But the very fear they had about them, their kids not, you know, being spared, they were the only ones that got to go into the promised land were the kids. See how God deals out the justice and, you know, makes his point. He allowed the kids to go in. The worst fear that those parents had was something happening to their kids. Isn't that amazing? You know, and fear can dominate us. It really can. And it turns it to our life as just a bunch. And I really appreciated Gabe's communion because it can just turn our activities with God into just these actions and, you know, religious rites or whatever you want to call it, just going through the motions, kind of a meaningless life of Christianity, Christian experience. And maybe you say, I can't help my fears. Let's talk about that. Because I have to say, I'm not going to leave you just sitting there going, yeah, you're sinful. Yeah, you're in fear. Let's talk about how we can overcome our fears. Number one, the thing I did on that moment is I confronted it. I said right then and there, I said, God, man, I realize I am a fearful person. And I started looking at all the different things in my life where, oh, my bank account, is that, am I going to be able to retire? I have all these fears about different things happening. Oh, what if I make this decision? It was horrible. But I confronted right then and there. I said, what is the spirit of fear? Where's it coming from? But God, I need your help in this, And I think sometimes I think back, and this is where Satan just whispers in your ear. The things that I did in my previous life were so horrible. I don't think God really is going to forgive you for that one, or, bring stuff up. But you can't run from it. That's why we have to confront it. You can't hide from your fears. You can't run from them. Now, I heard this story about this Canadian family that were so worried about a war coming out. And this is back in 92. And they were just terrified about this, a world war breaking out. So they decided that they were going to move. And they moved to the Falkland Islands. And the day they got there, 5 days later, because Falkland Islands were supposed to be the most remote, most safest, most neutral place on the face of the earth. 5 days later, the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands. And that was the Falkland War. Like I said, you can't run, you can't hide from your fears. Second thing you have to do is confess your fear to God. I had to confess it to God. I was like, I'm not trusting you. I'm not trusting all those things that you did for me. You brought me out of so much. You spared me from death, from cancer. You spared me from death from I don't know how many times before I became a Christian. And yet I'm going to be fearful now in my old age because of all the things that I think I did or did wrong or you couldn't overlook. There's a great passage in Psalm 34, verse 4. Talks about confessing this to God. He said, I sought the Lord and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. Just like any other sin, you got to confront it, you got to confess it, you got to repent and move on. And another thing we have to do is claim God's protection, promise of protection. The Bible's filled with God's promises. Now, I just wrote some passages down here. You can write them down later. I'm just going to go through them and read them. But you can find your own. Deuteronomy 131. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will not let you leave you or forsake you. Psalm 27:1. The Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Psalm 118:6. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Do not be afraid of sudden terror or trouble from the wicked when it comes. For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. And this is how you really know that, something is God's plan for you. Yesterday, I get these texts sent from this guy that sends me a daily text. This is the text he sent me. The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be saved. And then today he sent me one. It was 2 Timothy, the passage that I read already. And I hadn't talked to him. Didn't know that he was going to do that. And another thing that we really have to do is cultivate a closer relationship with God. There were two men that made it. They had a different view. It was Joshua and Caleb. And what was the difference between Joshua and Caleb and the other 10? I believe it was their relationship with God. Yeah. And what it was so powerful, a relationship with God, that Joshua and Caleb compared the Anakites, the giants, the fortified walls, the big cities, all these things these people had, and they compared it to God. The other 10 compared it to themselves. They compared the giants to themselves. They compared, that's where I really feel like I've messed up. When I start having fears and start seeing things, I'm comparing everything to what I can accomplish. Like when I was younger, I felt like I could work my way through that, or I can get around it. I wasn't comparing it to God. And that's when I got that email. It was so easy. Well, yeah, you're not up against me or my company. You're up against God. And that's what we have to do. Joshua and Caleb, they were uniquely different. We can do this, because God's going to do it. We're just going along for the ride. God, we can do it. It talks about them even in Numbers. They have followed me wholeheartedly. They were filled up with God. We have to cultivate this relationship with God. Think about those times in your life when being close to God has bailed you out of a situation or a fearful situation. And compare your situations, compare them to God, not to ourselves or to our abilities, to our resources, to our time, to our energy. You got to compare them to God. And what is the opposite of fear? Nope. Let's read it. 1 John 4:18. This even shocked me. It's love. You guys can't get one by you. There's no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. You say, well, how does that play out? And I started thinking about, how does love overcome fear? And then I remembered when my kids were little. And I remember being asleep and I hear one of them screaming at night. And we'd go into their bedroom, what's wrong? Thinking something was going on, like somebody was attacking them. They were afraid of the dark, or they were having a bad nightmare. It's not like I said, oh, you know what? Don't be afraid. Go back to sleep. No, we picked them up. We cuddled them. We loved them. We told them we loved them. We said, we're here. You're okay. We just showered them with love. I remember another time I was playing with my daughter, teaching her, coaching her in hockey. And we were just having a one-on-one time one time. And, she thought she was getting pretty good. And so she started getting a little aggressive with me. And so I let it go for a little while. But then when the sticks started getting swung at my shin pads and my legs, and she was getting a little rougher, I probably got a little too excited with her. And it freaked her out. And she dropped her stick and she just skated up and hugged me. That's what God does for us. We have those moments where we're just so fear, and all God wants us to do is climb up in his lap, come up to it. It seems so simple, but it seems like it's our last recourse. Isn't that who we serve, though? Isn't that our God? Anytime that fear confronts you, or you're confronted by fear, just think about the love of God and how much God is there for you. In conclusion, I want to talk to, I know a lot of this has been about Christians and believers. I want to talk about people that maybe don't believe. What's the biggest fear that you probably had when you were a non-Christian? I can tell you right now, mine was fear of dying. I didn't think about it often because I was young before I became a Christian, but times I thought about when I got myself in a situation and I thought this guy's going to kill me, I started thinking about, I don't want to die. Yeah. I don't want to die. We're all going to die, but we don't have to live in fear of it as Christians. I think about my dad. My dad used to say, when we were younger and as we got older, he's like, oh, when I die, just throw me in a burlap bag and float me down the river, Like he was so cavalier about it. Wow, I don't have that attitude about it. But then he had a problem. He had an aortic aneurysm, had a surgery, and he had some bad post-operative care. He ended up coding. And it was a real bad scene, and they gave him less than 1% chance to live. He survived. Prayed over him for like a week and a half straight, and he came back alive. And took 3 years to get him back to where he was. And then when he could understand what had happened, I remember him looking at me with the most fearful look on his face. He said, son, I don't want to die. Don't let me die. That's all he could. I started thinking about, well, that ain't what you said a while ago. You were so cavalier about the burlap bag. And I was trying to find out where I was going to find a burlap bag. But, and luckily he faced his fear. And a year before he passed away, he became a Christian. He got baptized. But that's the biggest fear. In Hebrews 2, verse 14, it says this. Oh no, it's not Hebrews, that's Philippians. That wouldn't make sense. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Death, and that's why we are who we are. There's people out there fearing for their lives. They do things, do everything they possibly can to keep themselves alive, have oxygen bottles in every room because they have a heart condition, When death comes calling, the oxygen bottle ain't going to save you. When death, I did everything I could to help my dad. He was in the hospital when he died, being taken care of, and they overlooked something. So when it comes, it comes. Yeah. But, you don't have to live a life in bondage, in fear of dying. As Christians, we understand that. We will live eternally. We'll die physically. And I'm not saying, I don't want to die. I want to live as long as I can. I want to see my kids grow up. I enjoy this life. God's blessed me tremendously, but not living in fear of it. It's so powerful. Fear is in our life. It's so real. It's so gets in there so easy. We have to overcome it. And, God calls us to his love. God calls us to remember who he is, not who we are, but that he's our Father and that he loves us and that we can overcome our fears. Let's allow God to love us and do that in our lives, brothers and sisters, and to God be the glory. Amen.